Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep Series 7 of today's Tolkien Times going as we begin Week 53 with our new Monday segment, Middle-earth Map Monday. Now, so far this series, we've looked at the Shire, the Old Forest, and the Barrow Downs last week. Continuing on with the early stages of the Hobbit's journey, we're going to make for the village of Brie. We're going to look at the etymology. We're going to look at the history. We're going to look at its geography, its people, and more. Let's start with what the book says. Always a good place to start. The chapter at the Sign of the Prancing Pony does a great job of putting a lot of useful information right up front. Brie was the chief village of the Brie land, a small inhabited region, like an island in the empty lands round about. Besides Brie itself, there was Staddle on the other side of the hill, Coombe in a deep valley a little further eastward, and Archet on the edge of the Chetwood. Lying round Brie Hill and the villages was a small country of fields and tamed woodland only a few miles broad. Then, after a bit about the people which we'll revisit, we read on. The village of Brie had some 100 stone houses of the big folk, mostly above the road, nestling on the hillside with windows looking west. On that side, running in more than half a circle from the hill and back to it, there was a deep dike with a thick hedge on the inner side. Over this, the road crossed by a causeway, but where it pierced the hedge, it was barred by a great gate. There was another gate in the southern corner where the road ran out of the village. The gates were closed at nightfall, but just inside them were small lodges for the gatekeepers. Down on the road, where it swept to the right to go round the foot of the hill, there was a large inn. It had been built long ago when the traffic on the roads had been far greater, for Brie stood at an old meeting of ways. Another ancient road crossed the east road just outside the dike at the western end of the village. The north road was now seldom used. It was grass-grown, and the Brie folk called it the Greenway. So, really, Brie is just the largest town in a group of settlements in relative isolation in Brie land, and that's about 40 miles east of the Brandywine. The town is located up against a hillside, with most of the homes looking to the west. Now, it is surrounded by a dike and hedge for protection, with gates on the west side and on the south corner. It's located near the meeting of the East Road and the Greenway. Now, the East Road runs from Rivendell all the way to the Grey Havens, but the Greenway began all the way up in Fornost and kept going all the way down to the fords of Ison, where it became the Great West Road and continued on all the way to Minas Tirith. Now, as for the people that lived there, the men of Brie were actually related to the men of the mountains and the Dunlendings. We read about this last week when we talked about the Barrow Downs. There we learned this in Appendix F on languages. In speaking about the language of the Dunlendings, Tolkien writes, "These were a remnant of the peoples that had dwelt in the vales of the White Mountains in ages past. The dead men of Dunharrow were of their kin. But in the dark years others had removed to the southern dales of the Misty Mountains, and thence some had passed into the empty lands as far north as the Barrow Downs. From them came the men of Brie." Now, the chapter tells us also that, according to their own tales, they were the descendants of the first men that ever wandered into the west of the Middle World. Few had survived the turmoils of the elder days, but when the kings returned again over the Great Sea, they had found Brie men still there, and they were still there now when the memory of the old kings had faded into the grass. So, after the realms in exile were founded, the Brie land became part of Arnor, and that's when they abandoned their old language, the one that was related to that of the Dunlendings, and adopted Westron, the common speech. Then in the Tale of Years, we read that around Third Age 1300, just as a lot of bad things are happening, orcs increasing in the Misty Mountains and the reappearance of the Nazgul, the folks of Brie welcome some visitors. That's where we read, "The Perianath migrate westward, many settle at Brie." And it would be another 300 years or so before a bunch of Brie hobbits left to found the Shire. Now, later on, when Fornost and Arnor fell around Third Age 1945, the North Road was no longer used as much. That's when it became overgrown and renamed the Greenway. Now, I'm not going to bother giving you the history of Brie during the War of the Ring. For that, just listen to, well, if not all 6 years of the PPP, you can listen to Season 3, which is the first book in The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, the first part of that book, and that's where we're going to cover a lot of the things that happen in Brie. For now, we're going to move on briefly to the etymology. For that, we're going to look at the nomenclature, where, believe it or not, most of the information on Brie can be found under the entry for Archet. The entry for Brie says only that it was an old name, of obsolete meaning in an older language, thus hinting at that connection to the language of the Dunlendings. Well, under Archett, we read this. Actually an English place name of Celtic origin, used in the nomenclature of Brie to represent a stratum of names older than those in the common speech or the Hobbit language. So also Brie, an English place name from a Celtic word for hill. Now, in The Return of the Shadow, Christopher Tolkien explains that Brie is based on Brill in Buckinghamshire, a place which he knew well, for it sits on a hill in the little kingdom of Farmer Giles of Ham. The name Brill is derived from the old British word Brie Hill, to which the English added their own word Hill, Hyll. And finally, in The Road to Middle-earth, Tom Shippey says that these place names, Brie, Coombe, Archett, and Chetwood, quote, contained non-English elements, and Tolkien needed words to sound queer, to imitate a style that we should perhaps vaguely feel to be Celtic. Now, both Christopher Tolkien and Tom Shippey say that Tolkien was inspired by that town named Brill, located about 10 miles to the northeast of Oxford in Buckinghamshire. And folks, that wraps it up for Middle-earth Map Monday. But if you have a mailbag question you'd like me to answer next series, please email it to barlin@theprancingponypodcast.com. Please do. The reason I'm covering maps this series is because the mailbag is just about empty. So send it in, let them know it's for Today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it just as soon as I can, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. Speaking of which, that's a great way to help me keep making this show better. Patreon.com/Tolkien Times. You can join the TTT Content Council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. Join me again tomorrow on Today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. On a podcast, please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps. And everybody, please follow @Tolkien Times on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.